One number, 4004 BC. Not from a scientist. From an Irish bishop named James Ussher, who spent years counting backward through biblical genealogies in 1650. His method made complete sense given the tools of his century. Other scholars attempted similar calculations and reached different dates. Ussher's version survived partly because it was later printed in the margins of certain King James Bibles, which gave it unusual authority. The problem is not Ussher. The problem is that nearly 4 centuries later, a version of that date is still being taught in many private religious schools and homeschool programs across America. Not as the history of a theological idea, as an alternative to modern science. Thomas Paine never wrote about geology or biology, but he wrote about what happens when a claim gets placed beyond the reach of examination. That is the thread of this video. Here is something that almost never appears clearly in popular discussions of this subject. The belief that the Earth is only a few thousand years old has existed within Christianity for a very long time. That part is accurate. But young Earth creationism, as an organized movement, one that presents itself as a scientific alternative to mainstream geology and biology, with institutional infrastructure, academic journals, museums, textbooks, and formal arguments designed to compete with professional science on evidential grounds. That version is not ancient. It was crystallized and propelled into mainstream American culture by a book published in 1960. 1. That distinction changes almost everything about how this debate should be understood. Look first at what was actually happening in the 19th century. When geology became a serious empirical discipline, when field geologists began mapping rock sequences across continents and producing systematic data about the order and age of geological formations, the mainstream of conservative Protestant theology did not treat this as an assault on Scripture. Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield was one of the principal architects of the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, the very doctrine that young Earth creationism invokes most frequently today as its theological foundation. Warfield was not a theological liberal. He was among the most rigorous conservative biblical scholars of the 19th century. And yet, Warfield did not conclude that an old Earth or certain forms of guided natural development were automatically incompatible with a high view of Scripture. He held that both the biblical text and the natural world had to be read carefully and honestly, and that careless readings of either could produce bad conclusions. Hugh Miller was a Scottish geologist and a man of genuine Christian faith who spent years in the field examining fossil-bearing rock layers. He wrote about what he found, including evidence of an Earth far older than 6,000 years. Without experiencing that evidence as a contradiction of his beliefs, he was not a marginal figure. He was one of the most widely read popular science writers of his era in Britain. These were not men on the fringes of evangelical Christianity. They were among its most serious thinkers. And neither of them concluded that accepting geological evidence required abandoning Christian faith. That matters for one specific reason. It means that even within the tradition of conservative Protestant theology, the tradition that young Earth creationism claims most directly as its heritage, yet as it exists today, is not the only conclusion that tradition ever reached. It is not the conclusion its most rigorous minds consistently arrived at when they looked honestly at the evidence. Then comes 1960. 1. John Whitcomb, a theologian at Grace Theological Seminary, and Henry Morris, a hydraulic engineer without specialized training in geology, published a book called The Genesis Flood, the Institute for Creation Research, which Morris later founded, describes that book as the major catalyst for the modern creationist movement. Historians of science have described it in similar terms. What the Genesis flood accomplished was specific. It took a religious conviction about the age of the Earth and reformatted that conviction as a scientific model, with geological arguments intended to compete directly with mainstream geology on evidential grounds. That shift is the one that matters most. Before 1960. 1. The belief that the Earth was young was primarily a theological position held by some Christians who read Genesis in a particular way. After 1960. 1. Young Earth creationism became a movement with scientific pretensions. It built institutions. It produced textbooks. It opened museums. It trained advocates who argued that mainstream geology had misread the evidence, and the geological claims inside that movement have to be evaluated against geological data, not against the sincerity of the people who made them, not against the authority of the text they were defending, against the evidence that physical science has produced. Paine recognized a specific asymmetry in situations like this. A claim about the physical age of the Earth is a claim about physical reality. Physical claims can be tested. They can be confirmed or disconfirmed by evidence that exists independently of any tradition. The question he returned to throughout his life was not whether any particular conclusion was correct. It was whether the conditions under which a conclusion was held actually allowed for honest examination. A conviction held sincerely is not the same as a conviction held correctly. Sincerity cannot substitute for examination. That is the question the rest of this video pursues, through several separate lines of physical evidence, each developed independently, each pointing in the same direction. In the Jack Hills of Western Australia, geologists have found grains of a mineral called zircon that formed during the early history of the Earth, not long after the solar system itself came together. You could lose one between your fingers without noticing. They are smaller than a grain of table salt. But inside each of them is a record that has been running since the earliest chapter of Earth history. And that record can now be read with precision that would have seemed impossible to any scientist working before the 20th century. Zircon forms inside molten rock at very high temperatures. When it crystallizes, its atomic structure does something chemically useful for measuring geological time. It accepts uranium into its crystal lattice while rejecting most lead. This matters because uranium decays into lead at a known and measurable rate. The radiogenic lead measured inside an ancient zircon crystal accumulated afterward through radioactive decay. The ratio of uranium remaining to radiogenic lead accumulated functions as a clock. It tells you how long that process has been running. Provided the crystal remained closed and lead did not escape or enter from outside after formation. In practice, geologists do not simply assume a crystal remained closed. They check. The uranium lead system produces two separate decay chains that can be plotted against each other on a diagram. When both chains give the same age, the result is called concordant, meaning the crystal behaved as a closed system and the age is reliable. When the two chains diverge, the result is discordant, meaning something disturbed the system after formation. Discordant results are recognized, treated with caution, and sometimes set aside, depending on what the discordance reveals about the sample's history. Concordant results from multiple grains in the same sample, all agreeing with each other, are what geologists use with confidence. Uranium 230. 8 decays into lead. 206 with a half. Life of approximately 4.47 billion years. This rate has been measured repeatedly in laboratory conditions across more than a century of independent work. The decay constants can be checked through comparisons with other isotope systems applied to the same materials. They do not shift based on who is measuring them or where. That is the first clock. The second uses potassium. Potassium 40 decays into argon. 40 with a half. life of approximately 1.25 billion years. This system applies effectively to many volcanic minerals and rocks, helping researchers identify when those materials crystallized or erupted. The key requirement is that the mineral must have remained closed to argon since it cooled. A more sophisticated variant called argon. Argon dating heats samples in steps and measures the argon released at each temperature increment, allowing researchers to identify and account for argon loss or contamination within the same analysis. Results that pass these internal checks consistently agree with ages from other methods applied to the same geological events. That is the second clock. The third uses rubidium. Rubidium. 80. 7 decays into strontium. 80. 7 with a half. Life of approximately 40. 8.8 billion years. This system is useful for many ancient rocks and for isochron methods, particularly when the strontium system has remained closed since the rock formed. An isochron analysis examines multiple minerals from the same sample simultaneously and checks whether they all produce a consistent age. When these conditions are met, the results agree with those from the uranium, lead, and potassium. Argon systems applied to the same geological events. That is the third clock. Now, here is what matters about having 3 rather than 1. All 3 systems are grounded in nuclear physics, and all 3 depend on the assumption that radioactive decay rates have been constant through time. Young Earth Creationism has proposed, through a research project called Radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth, that decay rates were dramatically accelerated in the past. This proposal has been examined carefully. Under known physics, the heat released by compressing billions of years of radioactive decay into thousands of years would have been enough to vaporize the oceans and melt the surface of the planet. No physically verified mechanism has been provided that could remove that heat while leaving the rest of the geological and biological record intact. Additionally, if decay rates had changed dramatically, the 3 isotope systems would be expected to produce very different ages from one another, because they operate at such different rates that any change would affect them unequally. What researchers consistently find instead, when appropriate samples are analyzed carefully, is that the 3 systems produce ages compatible within their respective uncertainties. 3 clocks running at vastly different speeds, built on different elements, with different failure modes, agreeing with each other when carefully applied. The agreement itself is evidence. It is what the physical world looks like when the underlying model is correct. Paine spent his life arguing that the natural world, examined honestly, is the most reliable guide available to any person. Not because nature flatters any tradition. The half-life of rubidium, 80. 7 is the same in every laboratory on Earth. The rocks carry their record whether anyone is looking or not. Picture the center of Greenland in winter. The ice sheet rises more than 3 kilometers above the bedrock beneath it. Each year, snow falls and compacts into a new layer. Summer snow compacts differently from winter snow. The ratio of oxygen isotopes in summer precipitation differs from the ratio in winter precipitation. The chemistry of dust, sea salt, and trace gases trapped in the ice shifts with the seasons. In the upper and middle sections of a well-preserved core, these annual cycles can be identified and counted, building a timescale layer by layer from the surface downward. In the 1990s, a research team drilled through that ice sheet and brought up a core more than 3 kilometers long. What they recovered was not just frozen water. It was a layered archive that, despite compression and flow at depth, preserves a remarkably continuous record of atmospheric and climatic conditions extending far back through time. In the deeper sections of the core, where ice has been compressed thin by the weight of everything above it. Individual annual layers become harder to distinguish. And researchers combine multiple chemical indicators while publishing explicit uncertainty ranges for their age estimates. The uncertainty is acknowledged. The limitations of the record are part of the published science. Here is how the method gets tested against something we can check independently. In April of 1815, the volcano Tambora, in what is now Indonesia, produced one of the largest eruptions in recorded human history. It sent enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. That sulfur deposited across the globe as sulfate particles, including onto the Greenland ice sheet. When researchers examine that section of ice cores, they find a sulfate signal at a position consistent with the independently constructed chronology for the year 1815. Large, historically dated eruptions provide independent chronological markers against which the ice core timescale can be checked. The chemistry of the ice and the dates of known historical events agree. That agreement, repeated across multiple eruptions and multiple independently constructed chronologies, confirms that the method is working. Now, apply that to what young Earth creationism requires. The YEC model places a global flood at approximately 2,300 to 2,400 years before the Common Era. Though different YEC chronologies vary somewhat within that range. A hydrological event of the scale the model describes would have to produce consequences across multiple independent archives simultaneously. Ice cores, lake sediments, cave formations, and coral records would be among the archives expected to preserve evidence of that disruption. Each in forms appropriate to the physical processes that build them. They would not all show the same thing, but many of them should show a disturbance. And the strongest long-term archives should align around the same interval in their respective timescales. The long-term records that have been studied do not show a globally correlated disturbance at that time. The Greenland ice core, for the relevant section, shows a continuous seasonal sequence. The sulfate signal from Tambora sits where the independently built chronology predicts it should appear, at the depth corresponding to roughly 4,000 years ago, where evidence of a global flood should be visible if the model is correct. The ice shows not catastrophe, but one season following another, the way seasons do. A globally correlated disturbance is required by the model. What researchers find instead is that each archive shows a continuous and internally consistent record through the period in question, with no synchronized disruption where the model predicts one must exist. Paine asked what it means for a claim to be genuinely testable. A claim that makes specific predictions about the physical world can be evaluated against what the physical world actually preserves. The ice does not belong to any institution. Tambora sits where the calendar and the ice core agree it should be. And in the section where a global flood should have left its mark, the record simply continues, season after season, as it always has. In the summer of 1815, a man named William Smith published a map of England, Wales, and part of Scotland, assembled from 15 sheets. It stood nearly 2 meters tall. It showed, in careful color, coded detail, the distribution of rock formations across the entire country, different colors for different layers for different periods of Earth history. Smith had spent more than 20 years traveling the English countryside by foot and by horse, examining quarries, road cuts, and canal excavations wherever he could find them. He was not a philosopher or a theologian. He was a surveyor and drainage engineer hired to figure out what lay beneath the ground. He was trying to find coal seams and plan canal routes. What he discovered across those 20 years changed science permanently. Rock layers appear in a consistent sequence across vast distances, not just in one county or one quarry, but everywhere he looked. And each layer contains a characteristic set of fossils that does not appear in the same combination in the layers above or below it. Smith called this the principle of faunal succession. If you find a particular set of fossils in a rock layer in Yorkshire, you will find the same set at the same stratigraphic position in Dorset, hundreds of miles away. The fossils serve as markers that tell you where you are in the sequence, regardless of where you are on the map. This was not a conclusion Smith reached from any theory about the age of the Earth. It was something he noticed by looking at rocks in hundreds of locations over more than 2 decades of fieldwork. The consistency was what the evidence kept showing him. Repeated so many times, it could not be attributed to chance. Now go back a century and a half earlier, to a naturalist working in Italy. Nicholas Steno published a geological treatise in 1660. 9. That established principles stratigraphy still uses today. The most fundamental is the principle of superposition. In an undisturbed sequence of rock layers, the layer at the bottom was deposited first, and the layer at the top was deposited last. The layers in between were deposited in the order they appear. This sounds simple. Its implications are not. A stack of rock layers is a physical record of time, readable by anyone willing to look carefully. Steno later became a Catholic priest, and eventually a bishop, beatified by the Catholic Church in 1980. 8. The person who gave geology its foundational principle and the person who devoted his later life to Catholic religious service were the same human being. He did not experience his geological observations as a challenge to his faith. He described his work as reading the history of creation in the physical structure of the Earth. These two stories belong together because they establish something important. Stratigraphy was not developed by people trying to undermine religious belief. It was developed by a drainage engineer looking for coal and a Catholic scholar who thought he was reading the work of God. The consistency they documented was not a conclusion they were reaching for. It was what the evidence kept showing them. Across different locations, different decades, and completely different motivations. Here is the connection that matters most. The time scale that stratigraphy builds from reading rock sequences is a relative one. It tells you that one layer is older than another. It establishes the order of events. What it does not do on its own is assign numerical ages in years. That came later. When radiometric methods were developed in the 20th century, when those methods were applied to the sequences that Smith and Steno had mapped, they confirmed the relative order that field observation had already established and supplied numerical ages for the positions in that sequence. Two completely separate lines of evidence. One built by reading the order of physical layers and the fossils within them. The other built from measuring radioactive decay in minerals. Developed independently by different people working in different fields at different times. Arrived at the same sequence. They did not agree because the scientists involved coordinated their conclusions. They agreed because they were both measuring properties of the same physical reality. A third line of cross-checking reinforces this. The chemical and isotopic fingerprint of volcanic ash is distinctive enough that researchers can identify the same eruption in multiple independent geological records at distant locations. When the same ash layer appears at the same relative position in independent records at multiple sites, and when its chemistry matches the expected signature of a known volcanic source, that agreement is not the product of coordination. The records at those sites captured the same physical event independently. And they match because the event actually happened. Stratigraphy has been tested from many independent directions. By engineers looking for coal. By companies searching for petroleum. By paleontologists studying fossils. And by geochronologists measuring isotope ratios in minerals. A drainage engineer and a nuclear physicist working a century apart arrived at the same answer. Because they were both measuring the same reality. Inside your genome, there are remnants of ancient viruses. Not viruses that function as infectious viruses now. Not something capable of spreading through your body like an infection. They are molecular scars. Marks left by events that struck your ancestors long before any human civilization existed. Before our species had taken its current form. Before the first word was written down anywhere on Earth. At some point, in the distant past, a retrovirus infected a reproductive cell in an ancestral lineage. The virus inserted a copy of its own genetic material into the DNA of that cell. The offspring carried the insertion. Their offspring carried it. And once fixed in a lineage, it has been copied through generation after generation. Written into the instructions that build each new organism, as automatically as any other inherited trait. Scientists call these inherited viral remnants endogenous retroviruses, or ERVs. Most have accumulated mutations over time and can no longer produce infectious virus particles. Some retain partial transcriptional activity and appear to have been repurposed by the host genome for functions unrelated to their original viral role. They sit in the genome the way an old scar sits on skin. A record of something that happened long ago, leaving a durable mark at the place where it occurred. Here is why they matter for understanding the history of life. When a retrovirus integrates its DNA into a host cell, the position of that integration is not predictable in advance. The probability of two independent integration events landing at the same genomic position in two separate lineages, with the same orientation and compatible surrounding sequences, is extremely small. Not just the same type of insertion, not just the same general region, the same scar, in the same place, in the same orientation. What researchers find when they compare the genomes of humans and other primates is that these species share a large number of ERV insertions at corresponding positions in their genomes. With consistent orientation, and with the subsequent mutations that would be expected if those insertions were inherited from a common ancestor, rather than acquired independently in each lineage. The pattern of shared insertions maps onto what the rest of the evidence about primate relationships already predicted. Species whose common ancestor with humans is more recent share more insertions. Species whose lineage diverged earlier share fewer. Across the primate family, the ERV evidence forms a nested pattern of shared and unshared marks that reflects a branching history of descent. Consistent with every other line of evidence that bears on primate relationships, the Gulo pseudogene provides a second and mechanistically different line of evidence pointing in the same direction through a completely different biological process. Most mammals produce their own vitamin C through a metabolic pathway that depends on a functional gene called Gulo. Humans, other great apes, and many dry-nosed primates cannot do this. The reason is not that the gene is absent. The remnant of it is still present in the genome, at the position where a functional Gulo gene would be expected to sit, carrying the molecular signatures of a gene that once worked and has since been inactivated, the pattern of which species carry the inactivated version and which retain a functional gene maps onto the expected pattern of primate relationships. Species whose common ancestor with humans is more recent share the inactivated version. Species whose lineage diverged earlier retain a functional gene. It is worth being precise about why ERV and Gulo matter separately and together. ERV insertions are the remnants of ancient viral integration events that were subsequently inherited through lineages. They represent something that entered the genome from outside and was passed down. Gulo inactivation represents something that happened to a gene already present. a functional sequence that lost its function and left a trace at the corresponding position. Two completely different biological mechanisms, operating through different processes, producing evidence that points in the same direction through independent means. Think about what a nested pattern of inherited marks looks like across a family of manuscript copies. A scribe copies an original text and makes a rare error, not present in the original. Every copy made from that scribe's version carries the error. Copies made directly from the original do not. Latter. A second scribe copies the first version and introduces an additional error. Every copy made from the second version carries both errors. A third scribe introduces yet another. The pattern of which copies share which errors allows a scholar to reconstruct the entire copying history without ever seeing the original. Because the errors form a nested structure that reflects exactly how the copies branched from each other over time. ERV insertions work the same way across species. An insertion that occurred in an ancestor common to all primates appears across primate genomes. An insertion that occurred later in the lineage, leading to humans and chimpanzees, but after that lineage separated from other primates, appears in human and chimpanzee genomes, but not in those of more distantly related species. The pattern is nested. It is hierarchical. It matches the branching structure that every other line of evidence produces when applied to the same question. Gulo inactivation adds a second independent layer to that same structure, through a completely different mechanism, telling a compatible story about which lineages share which history. This is not evidence that evolution might have occurred. It is evidence that if common descent is the correct framework, genomes should contain exactly this kind of nested pattern of inherited marks, with species sharing more recent ancestors, sharing more marks, and species sharing more distant ancestors, sharing fewer. That was a prediction that existed before the full genome sequences were available to test it. What researchers found when those sequences became available was what the prediction described. The genome does not adjust its contents based on what any tradition needs it to say. The ERV insertions were placed there by ancient viral infections and have been copied faithfully ever since. Reading them carefully is what honest examination of the available evidence requires. Several lines of physical evidence, radioactive isotopes in ancient minerals that converge across 3 different decay systems on an Earth measured in billions of years. An ice archive in Greenland that preserves a continuous seasonal record through the period when a global flood was supposed to have occurred. With no globally correlated disturbance, where the model requires one, rock sequences mapped by a drainage engineer in 1815 that were confirmed by nuclear physics a century later. Genomic scars shared across primate lineages in a nested pattern that reflects a branching history of common descent, supported by 2 independent biological mechanisms pointing in the same direction. Each of these lines of evidence was developed in different countries, by different researchers, across different centuries, asking completely different questions. None of them were designed to produce a verdict on young Earth creationism. They were designed to answer specific questions about the physical world, and they all point in the same direction. So the question worth asking now is not a scientific one. It is a structural one. A test is only a test if failure is possible. Both Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research require staff members to sign a statement of faith before employment. The Institute for Creation Research has stated publicly, in its own materials, that Scripture is the ultimate authority, and that science, in its own words, never trumps Scripture. Answers in Genesis states similarly that the Bible will always take precedence, and that apparent conflicts between scientific data and Scripture reflect either a misinterpretation of the data or a misinterpretation of Scripture. Never a genuine challenge to the biblical account. These are not statements made by critics of these organizations. They are statements these organizations publish about themselves. What those statements mean, in methodological terms, is specific. If a researcher working within either framework analyzes data and arrives at a conclusion that conflicts with a predetermined reading of Genesis, the framework requires that the data analysis be wrong. The conclusion about Scripture is fixed before the examination begins. The data must accommodate it. That is not a description of anyone's character or a judgment about anyone's sincerity. There are people working within these organizations who are genuinely trained, who conduct their work carefully, and who are convinced they are doing good science. The point is not about the people, it is about the structure they are working within. A framework in which the foundational conclusion is protected from the possibility of being overturned by evidence is a methodologically closed structure. It can be confirmed, because data that appears to support it is accepted. It cannot be disconfirmed, because data that challenges it is explained as a misreading. And a structure that can only be confirmed and never disconfirmed cannot be verified as correct in the ordinary sense of that word. Because the ordinary sense of verification requires that the opposite result was genuinely possible. That is what Paine was examining in The Age of Reason, published in 1790. 4. He was not constructing a formal philosophy of science. He was asking something more direct. What happens to a person's relationship with truth when the framework they inhabit has been designed so that no observation can challenge its central commitment? When questioning a claim becomes evidence of insufficient faith, rather than honest inquiry, his answer was that the person has been separated from one of the most important capacities a human being possesses: the capacity to update their understanding based on what the world actually shows them. 3 influential figures in stratigraphy, cosmology, and genomics demonstrate that this capacity is not an enemy of faith. Their working lives are the evidence. This is not only an abstract question. It has real consequences for people trained within such a framework who later enter fields that depend on these methods. In petroleum geology and mining, locating resources depends on stratigraphic sequences and geological timescales built on the same evidence that YEC rejects. In medicine and biology, understanding how pathogens evolve resistance to treatments and how genetic variation connects to disease risk draws on the same evolutionary framework that YEC treats as fundamentally mistaken. Someone trained within a curriculum that rejects these frameworks may find that portions of that foundation require adjustment when they enter professions, where these methods are daily operational requirements, not philosophical preferences. 1 read the rocks. 1 read the genome. 1 read the expansion of the universe itself. Georges-Henri Joseph-Édouard Lemaitre was a Belgian Catholic priest and a physicist who, in the 1920s, proposed that the universe was not static but expanding, and that tracing that expansion backward implied a beginning. His work became the theoretical foundation for what is now called the Big Bang. When Pope Pius XII suggested that this cosmological model provided scientific confirmation of the theological concept of creation, it was Lemaitre himself who pushed back. The priest and the physicist were the same person, and he argued carefully that a physical theory should not be recruited as a theological proof in either direction. He kept the 2 domains deliberately separate, not because he thought they were enemies, because he understood that collapsing one into the other distorted both, and that the integrity of each depended on respecting the difference between the kinds of questions each was equipped to answer. Francis Collins led the public effort of the Human Genome Project during the years when the first reference sequence of the human genome was completed. He has written openly about his Christian faith and about how reading the genome has never required him to abandon it. After the project, he founded an organization called BioLogos, specifically to argue that Christian belief and evolutionary science are compatible. That the nested patterns of ERV insertions and pseudogene distributions that the genome contains do not constitute evidence against faith, but rather a record of how life actually developed over time. He did not experience the genome as a threat. He experienced it as a record. And he found ways to hold that record alongside what he believed, without requiring one to erase the other. Nicholas Steno published the foundational principles of stratigraphy in 1669, and later became a Catholic bishop, beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1980. 8. The same life contained both things. Reading rock layers and serving the Catholic Church occupied the same person without contradiction. What these three lives demonstrate is not that faith and science always produce easy harmony. What they demonstrate is something more specific. Accepting that the universe began approximately 13.8 billion years ago, accepting that the Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old, accepting what the genome records about the shared history of life. None of these conclusions required these three people to abandon what they believed. They allowed the evidence to show what it showed. They did not require the physical world to arrive at a conclusion that had been determined before the examination began. That distinction is the one that matters most in this conversation. It separates stratigraphy from creation geology. It separates the Human Genome Project from an inquiry constrained by a prior statement of faith. And it is the distinction that Lemaitre and Collins and Steno embodied in their actual working lives. Not as a philosophical position they argued for, but as the way they actually did their work. The real question in this debate has never been whether God exists. The three people just described are evidence enough that serious engagement with physical evidence does not settle that question in either direction. The real question is narrower. Who has the authority to determine what the physical world shows? Is that authority located in the evidence itself? Available to anyone willing to examine it directly? Or is it located in a framework that decides in advance what the evidence is permitted to mean? Paine was asking that question in 1790. 4. Not as a geologist, not as a biologist, as someone who believed in God and who also believed that no institution, no tradition, no framework assembled by human hands, however old or however sincerely maintained, had the right to stand between a person and their own honest examination of the world they live in. Back to 4004 BC, Ussher did the best work he could with the methods available to him in the 17th century. That is genuinely true. And it deserves to be said, without condescension. The problem did not begin with Ussher. It began later. When multiple independent lines of evidence developed across different disciplines, built by people with faith and without it, all pointing consistently toward an Earth measured in billions of years. At that point, some followed the evidence. Others chose to protect the number. One read the rocks and became a bishop. One read the genome and wrote about faith. One calculated the expansion of the universe and warned others not to turn physics into theology. What distinguished their approach was not that they believed less. It was that they did not require the physical world to confirm what had already been decided. Young Earth creationism may be held as a sincere religious conviction, and that sincerity deserves acknowledgement. But sincerity does not transform a conclusion fixed before the evidence was examined into a verified scientific model. The difference between those two things is what Thomas Paine spent his life trying to make visible in language anyone could read. The revolution once made his name something this country celebrated. The Age of Reason helped turn that same name into something many Americans preferred not to mention. Not because his questions had been answered, because the cost of being associated with them had become too high for many of his former admirers. He died in a rented room in New York in 1809. A small number of people came. The question did not go with him. It is still here, and it has always been yours to answer.